Her name is Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
I hope I pronounce her name properly. Thais Gibson.
I am so excited for you to be here with me today. Thank you for joining us. Hello and welcome to a new type of podcast episode we are recording at the Personal Development School podcast, where we are going to talk about real issues that people are facing. We are taking real questions from real individuals like yourself who are going through different challenges. And we're going to talk today a little bit about a few core different dynamics. I'll go through 3 questions today from different individuals who, number one, are struggling to feel lovable and have a big core wound around feeling unloved. We'll talk about how this core wound works as I answer this question this afternoon, and we will dive into what you can do if you are struggling with a different core wound yourself. We'll even cover some of what the major core wounds are and how they can sabotage our relationships. In the second part of this episode, we will talk about another really interesting question from a real person, all about avoidant attachment styles, video games, and how these things may be a creature comfort that may stand in the way of a healthy, thriving relationship, and where that line really is between what's healthy and what becomes unhealthy. And lastly, we'll dive into a question coming out of California about intimacy in relationships, specifically between a fearful avoidant attachment style and a dismissive avoidant attachment style, and how generally when we get to the power struggle stage of love and relationships, it can become a little bit trickier to understand what's going on here. So we'll talk about that and what you can do, how you can navigate it as I go through these real questions from real people like yourself. Now, if you want to post a question at any point and get it answered on our show here, you can check out the Reddit thread, Can This Be Fixed? And this is a place where you can post your questions. We will be selecting them, and people are more than welcome to post their ideas, insight, and shares along that Reddit thread as well. So the very first question I have here today is coming out of Ontario, Canada, which is originally where I'm from. And this question is from Caroline, who's 32 years old. And Caroline says, I'm struggling to feel like I am lovable. I've spent most of my adult life going through intense personal relationships. And when they end, I go back to feeling like if I was more lovable, this wouldn't be happening. I used to feel this way a lot throughout my early childhood, and it sends me into a deep emotional spiral. And it also scares me and prevents me from entering into future relationships. I want love, but I am also so afraid of attaching to someone and then getting hurt all over again. As you can probably tell, I am a fearful avoidant. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about the core wound, I am unlovable, and how that core wound forms. And then we'll dive into how you can recognize and reprogram this core wound, Caroline, but also we'll talk about how any listeners right now can also dive into reprogramming core wounds. So the first thing I want you to understand is that our core wounds are really kind of like our relationship baggage. When people use the term baggage, what they're usually referring to is these deep triggering wounds that we are carrying, and they come from previous experiences and past relationships. And I think it's really important for us to understand that when we have a triggering event, okay, so let's say that somebody pulls away and you get triggered if you're listening to this, and you get afraid of being abandoned. You could take a dismissive avoidant attachment style who somebody pulls away from them and they're probably not going to get that triggered. But you can take somebody who's anxiously attached and somebody pulls away from them and they may get extremely triggered. And what this is really showing to us is that the subjective experiences that we're having are really what are outweighing the objective content of the experience. In other words, if somebody pulls away from one person or another person, the objective content is still the same, right? That somebody's pulling away, but it's going to affect us based on our subjective interpretation of things. So if we take a person who has a pre-existing core wound of abandonment, that is what is going to come up. And what often happens is, our conscious mind is not choosing these things, right? If you look at your conscious mind is responsible for 3 to 5% of your beliefs, your thoughts, your emotions, and your actions. So nobody's choosing to feel like Caroline is saying here, unlovable, right? What a painful thing to feel, let alone choose. Nobody's waking up saying, today, if somebody pulls away from me, I'm going to tell myself I'm unlovable and then make myself feel terrible about it. These are pre existing subconscious programs. And because they are subconscious, they are a part of our identity. In other words, we are bringing them everywhere with us. And this is why I mentioned it's kind of our relationship baggage, because for lack of a kinder term, essentially we get imprinted at a subconscious level with things that hurt us in our childhood. And then because we are carrying that programming that's imprinted on our subconscious mind, we then tend to re-project that outwards. In other words, if you felt afraid of being abandoned as a child, you are going to keep projecting this likelihood of abandonment as soon as you see patterns change or things that create uncertainty in you as an adult. And the important thing about this is that not only can we recognize these things, but we can reprogram them. And we're going to talk about how to do that for Caroline's question here. But when you take a look at the different core wounds and how they affect us, there's some really major core wounds. And I talk about this a lot in the perspective of integrated attachment theory, this body of work that we published, where we talk about how different attachment styles have these different core wounds, different basically pieces of baggage they're projecting out onto the world. And again, these core wounds often come from pre-existing unresolved emotional experiences. So, if we had negative emotional experiences in childhood, we are likely to keep projecting the likelihood of those things occurring as adults. Now, there's a good reason for this before we get back to Caroline's question. We project these things and their likelihood of occurring as an adult because our brain is wired for this. We're survival wired at the end of the day. So, I always give this analogy. If you're walking through the forest one day on the way to see your friend and you see a bear and you run away and you make it out of the woods safely, but the next day you have to walk back down the same path. As you're walking back down the same path again to see your friend, you don't think of the pretty tree or the pretty flowers that were sitting next to the bear. You remember the bear and its teeth. And so we're actually wired to hang on more to negative feelings and negative outcomes because we store them so that we can project them again in the future. Oh my goodness, watch out. Tomorrow I'm going back down the same path. I better remember there's a bear there and I better be on the lookout. And we're wired that way from a survival perspective. But of course, we're not really walking through the woods trying to run away from bears any longer in our lives. Instead, we're often in a position where we project these negative outcomes from unresolved childhood experiences. And this is where a lot of those attachment wounds are born. So, before we get into how we can really rewire this, and before I answer Caroline's question in more detail, I just want to say that, it's really valuable for you as the listener to recognize your core wounds. And I'll talk about them by attachment style for just a moment here. So, the anxious attachment style, if you tend to resonate more with being anxiously attached, finding yourself being needy, clingy, fearful in relationships, you'll probably find that you have big core wounds, okay, or big fears that you're carrying. I'm going to use those terms interchangeably because our core wounds are what we fear. You'll probably find yourself fearing as an adult, being abandoned, being unsafe if somebody pulls away from you, being alone forever. You probably find yourself fearing being excluded or disliked or rejected or feeling not good enough. Okay. And those tend to be some really common core wounds of the anxious preoccupied. And there's some other ones in there too. Anxious preoccupieds can fear being, unloved. Absolutely. Feeling unseen or unimportant. And those can be quite big triggers as well, but not as much as the original ones I just mentioned. If you are, and by the way, as I'm going through these, please make a note of them mentally. And, I'll talk about how we can reprogram and how this all works. Because when we learn how to reprogram our subconscious, this is how real change and transformation truly happens. And we'll talk about why in just a moment as well. That's so meaningful. So when we look at the dismissive avoidant, their big core wounds tend to be around fearing being trapped or helpless or powerless, especially if they're in the wrong relationship or their needs aren't getting met. seeming defective or as if something's wrong with them. We talk a lot about how the I am defective core wound is a big result of childhood emotional neglect, because when a child is wired for this connection and depth with somebody, and they can't seem to get their hands on that as a child, and they're yearning for it, a child's mind personalizes everything. So they don't sit there and go, oh, my parents are emotionally unavailable. They instead sit there and go, oh, there must be something wrong with me that I'm not able to connect. And they really internalize that. And that produces a lot of shame, a lot of there must be something wrong with me, or I am defective core wounding. We also have a fear of being unsafe emotionally if somebody's too open or tries to rely on somebody else, and the fear of not belonging, this sort of assumption that dismissive avoidants tend to carry around, that they won't belong, and or that they will be very weak if they are vulnerable. And some other honorable mentions is dismissive avoidants can struggle with the I am disrespected core wound and really take that to heart as well, or the I am stupid core wound, sort of like I am not capable of change. Now, fearful avoidance basically share in both sides. So I know it can seem overwhelming if you're listening to this, like, oh my gosh, I have all these core wounds. But please keep in mind, although these wounds can follow us around for our entire lives, decades and decades, they actually don't take that long to reprogram. They're not actually that difficult to move through. So we're going to talk a lot about that in terms of how to do that and how to navigate the reprogramming experience. Now, fearful avoidants have the anxious core wound. So I will be abandoned. I will be excluded. I am not good enough. They can really fear that. I am unseen or unheard or unimportant. They can have a tough time with that. But they also have the I am trapped, helpless, and powerless on the more dismissive avoidance side. But they have some of their own unique core wounds that can be quite strong. And those big ones are I will be betrayed. I am unworthy, and I am bad. You can really see in a fearful avoidance behavior, they often go out of their way to present as like innocent or good. And we can even see that a little bit in anxious preoccupieds as well. So once you recognize your core wounds, what you want to next understand is that like these are the pieces of baggage you carry around, right? These are the ideas you have about yourself that you're constantly fearing people will find out or fearing will be recurring. And you probably find that you literally go quite far out of your way to prevent these things from happening. So you, as I mentioned earlier, you might go out of your way to seem innocent or over explain yourself if you have an I am bad core wound. Or you may really, really try to be good enough all the time if you think that deep down you're not good enough or you fear feeling like that again. Or you may be very suspicious and on high alert if you have an I will be betrayed or I can't trust core wound. So you can see how these things show up and really impact so many areas of our lives. So, what do we do about this? And how does this relate back to Caroline's question? So, Caroline said, I'm struggling to feel like I'm lovable. And then mentioned that every time a relationship falls apart, her mind goes to that meaning. It goes, oh, if I was more lovable, this relationship wouldn't have ended, and then goes down through this really painful spiral. Well, Caroline, when you now start to see that these core wounds probably come from past experiences, and you even mentioned this in your question, which was really interesting to me. You mentioned that you had a lot of experiences like this in childhood. So sometimes as children, we may grow up in a household where we don't get our needs met, or we feel hurt, or we don't understand something and we go, oh, I'm not loved. And the moment we give that meaning to something that we can't properly process, this is how your subconscious mind gets programmed with these core wounds to begin with. So if you constantly feel unlovable as a child and you tell that story and you go through making that assumption over and over again, we fire and wire these neural pathways. And so through a lot of the repetitive emotions in this experience, it's really a lot of repetition and emotion that fire and wire our own subconscious mind's neural pathways. And so when we start digging into this and we can really see this more deeply, you can then start to recognize that, okay, this is probably a pre existing narrative. Now, the difference between your conscious mind and subconscious mind and unconscious is really interesting and is also very vast. And we need to understand this before we talk about how to get rid of these pieces of baggage, the I am unloved core wound, or whatever core wound as a listener you may find yourself carrying. So the conscious mind is responsible for roughly 3 to 5% of your beliefs, your thoughts, your emotions, and your actions. And your subconscious and unconscious collectively are responsible for 95 to 97%. And when we look at the difference, one of the marking differences between your subconscious and unconscious mind is that your subconscious mind you can retrieve information from a lot more easily. So, this is what we really work with here. You can remember, like you said in your question, I experienced feeling like this a lot as a child. And so that's you tapping into those sort of subconscious pre existing memories. Oh, yeah, it's out of my conscious awareness right now. But when I reflect on it, I realize that I did feel this way as a child. I did feel, like I was unloved. So, how do we shed and let go of these old pieces of baggage once and for all? Well, we dive into subconscious reprogramming, arguably one of my favorite topics to discuss. So, as I mentioned earlier in Carolyn's question, right? Carolyn, you probably don't find yourself going, today I'm going to wake up and I'm going to tell myself I'm unlovable multiple times over and see what happens, right? These are not choices. These are programs, pre existing programs that get triggered or catalyzed to come to the surface. And then we feel all of the negative emotion attached to that pre existing trigger. And so, when we want to reprogram this trigger or triggering event, we need to leverage how we got programmed to begin with. Now, what did we say earlier? We said the subconscious gets programmed through repetition and emotion because that is what fires and wires the neural pathways. Do you know what else has a huge impact on the subconscious mind? Imagery. Okay. And that's really going to matter when we come back to this in a few minutes. We're going to talk about how imagery plays a big role in subconscious reprogramming. So, when we want to change an old belief, a belief that we can consciously recognize is not serving us, you know what? It doesn't feel good to tell myself this story that I am unlovable. It doesn't feel good to, in Carolyn's example, get into a relationship. If it doesn't work out, then tell myself it's because I'm unlovable and then go through a tailspin of negative emotions, right? What a painful thing to think and feel. And yet, do you realize that we all do this? We all, until we spend a lot of time doing subconscious reprogramming work, tend to tell ourselves really painful stories about why things don't work out in our favor. Maybe you found that you didn't get the job that you were hoping for. Well, what story do you tell about that? What do you make that mean about you? I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. Or maybe you didn't get to go on a second date with somebody you were interested in. Do you make that mean you're unworthy? So we want to start recognizing when we go through an event that's highly uncomfortable, usually it's mostly because we're making it extra uncomfortable with the meaning we give. So when it comes to reprogramming, we need three ingredients. We need repetition, emotion, and imagery. But how do we leverage these three ingredients? Well, first, what you want to take a look at, and there's this really powerful starting tool. There's so many different tools, by the way. We have a course in the personal development school called 21 Tools to Reprogram Your Subconscious Mind. But one of my favorite ones to start with is called autosuggestion. Okay. It's a form of belief reprogramming. And I've taken a concept and really turned it into an exercise here. So, autosuggestion, belief reprogramming. This comes from roots in hypnosis. I have a background in hypnosis, but also in cognitive behavioral therapy. I've sort of overlapped the two here to create this exercise. So, step one, we start by finding this core wound. And hopefully, it was helpful for you if you noticed which core wounds you had from earlier. So, if you remember, you might have made a painful situation mean I'm abandoned, or I'm going to be excluded, or disliked, or trapped, or helpless. So try to look at a time that you can remember where you had a painful core wound, and then we want the opposite. So it's very easy to find the opposite, as you can imagine. What would you think of the opposite of Caroline's core wound? If I was more lovable, this wouldn't be happening. Well, I am unlovable. The opposite is I am lovable. Okay. If you're afraid of abandonment, I am connected. Or afraid of being trapped, I am free. Afraid of being betrayed, I can trust, right? So we find the opposite of that core wound, step one. Step two, we need repetition, emotion, and imagery. You got these core wounds. How? Through repetition, emotion, and imagery, through repeated experiences that elicited a negative emotional response. So we need to leverage those same key parts. So we find repetition, emotion, and imagery to support your new self concept. I am unlovable. I am lovable. So let's take a look here. I am unlovable. I am lovable. So now I need repetition, emotion, and imagery for I am lovable. How do we get repetition? We come up with 10 pieces of memory for when we actually felt lovable. Why memory? Well, we choose memory because memory is a series of emotions and images. Can you imagine for a moment that I say to you, hey, I want you to tell me your favorite childhood memory? And maybe you close your eyes and you start telling a memory or a story about how you were playing on the playground as a child and how much fun you had. As you tell that story, you would start smiling and your body language would open up and your posture would change because you would still have the emotions contained within that memory. And guess what else you would see? You would see the images of the memory itself in your mind's eye. So if you sat there and you said, oh, I was playing on the playground and I had these friends that I was playing with, you would see the images of the slide of the playground and you would actually see yourself in those images. So you would be leveraging through coming up with old pieces of memory, images, and emotions. Now we have the three key ingredients for how to reprogram. Now, research shows it takes 21 days to form new, solid neural pathways. The deeper the wound, the more the time horizon there. So you can imagine that maybe if we have a really deep wound that we got at a really young age, we may want to extend that 21-day period out a little bit. Research shows it can take up to 63 days to actually reprogram all the way down to the unconscious mind. And the unconscious mind is really the container for very, very deep memories, usually before you can really remember memories. So things that are very difficult to retrieve. Again, it's one of the differentiating factors between the subconscious versus unconscious. Now, what you would do here, just to summarize this 3-step exercise, is you would go, number one, what's my core wound and its opposite? I am unlovable. I am lovable. Number two, I need 10 memories of times I felt lovable. Number three, repeat for 21 days. And if you know that you adopted this core wound even earlier and that it's really been a difficult one for you to overcome, you may want to do this for a little bit longer, somewhere between that 21 to 63-day range. Again, the vast majority of people do not need to go all the way to 63 days, but it is meaningful to keep in mind. Now, let's go back here for a second. What do you do for that 21 days? Do you just reread those 10 memories? Well, yes, you can reread them. The idea is to leverage as much emotion and imagery as possible. So, as long as you can be really present and you can really see those images and feel about them when you're thinking of those memories, it only takes a couple of minutes to do this each day, but it can have a hugely profound effect. We can also create variations of this exercise. So you can also sit there and rewrite 10 new ways you felt lovable. Okay. 10 other memories. And you can do that for 21 days if you can come up with all those different memories. But I find the easiest way to do this is to write out the 10 memories, then record them into your phone, and then listen back to them in the morning or evening. Now, we have this really interesting place, and I bet you can maybe guess where we're most suggestible, okay, where we're most open to being reprogrammed. We have these really interesting windows. Can you guess what they are? Well, they are the first hour that you wake up and the last hour before you go to bed. And because your brain is producing a little more alpha brainwaves during this time, we are more likely to be programmed. Okay. So, what I would say here in summary to your question, Caroline, before we dive into the avoidance and video games, before we dive into the fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant intimacy dynamic and relationships, the thing I would say here, Caroline, is it's not your fault that you feel like this. It's a painful thing to feel, but it's your responsibility, meaning that you can fix it. And it's a really terrible thing to feel after a relationship ends, to think that you're not lovable, because of course that's not true. But I can tell you that all the time. You can even consciously understand that from a logical perspective, but it will only stop hurting when we address this at the subconscious level, meaning we have to speak to our subconscious mind. The subconscious mind speaks in the language of emotion and imagery. If I say to you for a second, anybody listening, if I say, hey, whatever you do not think of a chocolate chip cookie. You probably imagined a chocolate chip cookie, didn't you? And it's because your conscious mind speaks in language. Your subconscious mind speaks in emotions and images primarily. And so when we just try to target the conscious mind through language to things like affirmations, I am lovable, I am lovable, lovable. The problem exists at the subconscious level, right? We're not consciously choosing to tell ourselves that. It's a subconscious pre existing program. So just by talking to our conscious mind in language, we don't really move the needle on this. And that's why I'm such a firm believer that true transformation literally exists by engaging our subconscious mind in the process of change and in the process of healing. So for Caroline, to sum this up, I would say do some reprogramming work. Use this tool, come up with 10 different memories of times you felt really lovable and record this back, listen back to this as much as you can in that first hour of the day or last hour before you go to sleep. And this will help you rewire this old wound that you never deserved to have in the first place and feel a greater sense of self esteem in your own ability to be lovable and to receive love. And this will then, in turn, help you to not feel so afraid of attaching because you'll feel this deep sense of lovability. And that will make a huge impact. So, I am going to dive into the next question. We're going to take a quick break here, but I'm going to dive into this next question where we're going to go through some of the different dynamics for an avoidant attachment style and the love of video games and how this may or may not impact your relationship. Welcome back to Can This Be Fixed? A show where we take real questions from real people and we dive into answering them in a way that hopefully can apply to anyone listening or maybe going through something similar. Maybe it's somebody in your family life that you know going through something similar to one of the questions or a friendship. And my hope for you is that whether it's for you or someone else, you can have a much greater understanding of what's really going on in our relationships or multiple areas of our life, and in turn, be able to fix some of these different dynamics. So, our next question here is from Julie, who's 45 years old in California. And Julie says, can you please tell me a little bit about the love of video games and dismissive avoidant attachment style? I am in a 15-year relationship with a dismissive avoidant who always says he doesn't have time for us. Yet he plays endless hours of video games and doesn't seem to ever make an effort for the actual relationship. I feel like he's literally addicted to video games at this point and will stay up until all hours of the morning playing with friends, and yet still not making time to do things like go out on a simple date. Please help. So, what do we know about the avoidant attachment style and creature comforts? Well, we know that for dismissive avoidance and fearful avoidance alike, they both tend to get this label where they're like pretty good self soothers. Now, I have a big bone to pick with that. I don't think that could really be further from the truth. I tend to feel that dismissive avoidance and fearful avoidance alike are not necessarily great at self soothing, but more like self numbing. One of the big differences I would say between self soothing and self numbing is that self soothing is us actually getting to the bottom of things and resolving root cause of why we felt emotionally frustrated or sad or disrupted in some way to begin with. So let's just go through an example here for a moment and then we'll dive into this question. You know, if somebody is a fearful avoidant attachment style or a dismissive avoidant, let's stay on dismissive avoidant for this conversation, and they feel stressed about their boss not respecting their boundaries at work, they may come home and their form of quote unquote self soothing may be to sit down and play countless hours of video games. That's just numbing and distracting and really suppressing the problem, just avoiding the problem. Self soothing would look like I'm driving home from work. I realize that I'm feeling frustrated. I tune into myself and I'm like, why do I feel bad? Oh, I feel frustrated or upset because my boss isn't respecting my boundaries. Okay, how can I solve for this? What do I need to feel relief? Oh, I need to go to my boss and politely say that while I really value my job and care about this, I am happy to go out and go above and beyond as much as I can. But here's where my boundaries are. Okay. So, for example, you might say, listen, I really care about this company. I really want to show up and go above and beyond. and I have a family at home and I have a lot of responsibilities. So I'm happy to stick around for an extra 15 or 20 minutes late each day, Monday through Friday, for a period of time while we're going through this transition phase. But I'm not able to do that forever or on an ongoing basis. And that's where my boundaries are, right? And so, what we're doing when we self soothe is we're really attuning to self, figuring out why we're upset and what we're feeling, and then we're solving on behalf of it. And unfortunately, when we look at a lot of dismissive avoidance, they're not self soothing, right? They're not like emotionally attuning to themselves, conveying or communicating to self, oh, I'm feeling sad or frustrated or angry. And here's why, instead they're just not feeling good and usually shoving things way down emotionally, kind of trying to stuff them down with distractions. And so, this can range their creature comforts or ways of distracting or numbing can range from things like binge eating food and sugar or drinking too much or smoking weed or you name it. But it can also include things like gambling, video games, all these sorts of dynamics. Now, I'm not going to sit here because I don't believe this. I'm not going to sit here and say anybody who plays video games is numbing or anybody who ever drinks alcohol is numbing. I think that the relationship we have to these things is what matters, right? If somebody plays a video game once a week or, drinks alcohol on the weekend with a friend socially, like these are not things that are necessarily numbing. We can do this because we enjoy this. It's social, it's fun, it's a hobby. We get enjoyment and fulfillment out of it, and we're not using it as a coping mechanism. But you'll know the difference. And maybe this is even a question that you listening right now can reflect on. Everybody tends to have their creature comforts. Are you using these creature comforts as a form of self numbing in an attempt to self soothe? Or do you have an overall fairly healthy relationship to these things? Now, I can tell by Julie's question here that clearly, playing video games till all hours of the morning and never making time for the relationship, it does seem like quite an addictive habit. And I do truly believe that people can become addicted to video games just like they can become addicted to gambling. And there can be a lot of intermittent reinforcement, novelty needs, all sorts of things. So, I want to talk about here just for a moment some of the wiring and kind of science behind this addictiveness to games to begin with. And then we'll talk about what Julie can do here. Okay. So, when we look at the science behind how we sort of get addicted to things, there's a lot of interesting components at play. Obviously, there's a brain chemistry component, but what I found more than anything is that we tend to get the most stuck on investing in things that meet our deeply unmet needs. And so what happens is we'll often when I've worked with a lot of people in the past who would come to me and say, "Hey, I have," I'll give one example here. I had a client at one point and they came to me and they said, "Look, I'm really struggling with addiction to pornography." And so we looked, okay? We didn't start by judging it and shaming it because that doesn't do anything for us. We have to look with an attitude of curiosity. We look at, well, what needs does pornography meet? This person was also a dismissive avoidant attachment style. And the big needs, when we had an honest discussion about it, were novelty, a sense of control, a sense of connection, a sense of safety, and pleasure. And so we have these five needs. And when we asked this individual, when I asked this client at the time, well, are these needs being met in your life outside of pornography? Let's score how much these things are being met in your life from 1 to 10. Well, guess what? All of those scores came back really low. He felt like he didn't really have another source of pleasure in his life. He felt like he didn't really have a sense of control. And he didn't feel like there was a lot of novelty and safety in his ability to connect with people. So those five things were kind of missing. And so all at once, pornography is a subconscious strategy to meet multiple of those needs at the same time. And when there's on top of that, the ability to do things like get connection, even though it's not the same type of connection as being in person with somebody, when there's this ability to get connection, in a way where, okay, I can get my needs met for connection, but I don't have to be vulnerable. I don't have to move towards any of my fears or wounds in the process. I can literally get connection without even having to address those fears or wounds. It's even easier for us to get stuck in more addictive patterns. And he had a lot of vulnerability fears as a dismissive avoidant. So he found himself getting his needs met while bypassing his core wounds or fears. Hence why it was sort of a recipe for this to become an addictive pattern. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say this is the only thing that applies to full scale, full blown addictions, but it's a very interesting thought exercise for discovering why we seem to foster dependency on some things more than others and what that says about our deeply unmet needs. And when we make an effort to get those deeply unmet needs met in healthier forms, it helps break dependencies. So that's a bigger topic of conversation, maybe for another episode. But let's talk about let's go back here to Julie's question from California. So Julie says, can you tell me about the love of video games and DA? So dismissive avoidant attachment style. So, this man who is your 15-year relationship plays tons and tons of video games all hours of the night. This to me, when we look at the relationship that he has to video games, it's too much, right? Like this is not, oh yeah, this is a fun activity. This is like a hobby that I have. This is obviously way beyond that. It seems to be a little bit of a dependency that's being fostered. And that sort of goes par for the course for the creature comforts, that numbing dynamic or cycle that can often happen with an avoidant attachment style. So when we take this a step further, what can Julie do about it? Well, Julie cannot change his behavior. Julie can only really choose how to respond. Julie can encourage him to work on his own behavior. He could seek counseling or therapy or something to sort of break that addiction, or just even start by trying to set some boundaries around video games, realizing that there's a little bit more of a dependency being fostered here. And he could go through that thought exercise, right? Of, okay, well, what needs do video games meet? Now, I've had discussions with clients, with people in the personal development schools, courses, on our webinars and in our programs, countless times about this topic. And again, you'll see the same types of needs being met in a similar way. So you'll see that video games tend to meet the need for social connection in a safe way that's not very vulnerable, right? You're not meeting in person. You don't have to go through all the awkward eye contact stuff if you feel awkward around people. You're connecting from behind a screen. You can literally just leave the video game or the interaction immediately if you'd like to. And interestingly, I've found that sometimes there's a bit of a correlation between people who are really into video games and people who struggled socially at different points in their life in various degrees and different forms. Not always, but strong correlation. Now, we can look at what other needs are being met. Okay. Social connection without being vulnerable. There's also this element of novelty again. Sometimes there's this element of learning or challenge. Okay. Almost like growth because you're growing through different levels in different ways. And again, all without having to be vulnerable. So interestingly enough, when I've had discussions about individuals who have a little bit or a lot of dependency fostered around video games, they tend to have deeply unmet needs for, you guessed it, social connection, novelty, and growth, maybe personal growth in various forms. And so if we decide we want to work through our dependencies around this, one of the big cornerstones of doing just that is to be able to sit down and find new ways of getting these needs met in forms that are a little healthier, so that these buckets, if you imagine your needs are like buckets in the subconscious mind, they're not running on empty, where then, oh my gosh, video games are the only way to get these needs met. And they may even be like a more superficial way of getting the needs met, meaning a less efficient way of getting those needs met or those buckets filled than if we went more direct to the source. We learn to get empowered and feel comfortable in social connections or trying new things or doing some deeper personal growth work rather than growing through levels of a video game. Now, that's really between him and his counselor or therapist or some of the inner work he may want to do at some point. What can Julie do here in this particular case? Well, Julie can encourage him to do that work. But I think Julie, rather than this being more focused on him and where he's at, it's really a question of, what are your needs? What are you looking for in a relationship? And are you happy? And what I would highly recommend doing, Julie, is sitting down and making a list of what needs you're looking to have met in a relationship and those things that are really important to you, and describing what that really looks like. So, do you need to feel prioritized in your relationship? Do you need to feel like there's a certain degree of quality time? And if so, how much? Do you need to feel like this person's willing to work on things in a relationship with you? What are your needs in a relationship? And I'll even put a link down below to a free download all about your needs, and also a free download about how to reprogram the subconscious mind. And when we take a look here at our needs, it's really valuable to take a look at the different needs that you have in a relationship with somebody and ask yourself, from 1 to 10, how much are these really important needs? If I wrote down my top 5 or 10 needs from a relationship, how much are these things being met? And if the scoring is very low, if we're not hitting close to like 80% of the way, which I think is a very fair goal to have, I would even say opt for something closer to 90. But, in the very least, we have the 80-20 rule. And if you're not seeing 80% of your needs being met, or somewhere really close to it, I would then turn around and set a deadline. And what I mean by a deadline is a deadline for the amount of time you will continue in a relationship if your needs aren't being met. Now, this deadline will look different for different people. Okay. If you're extremely unhappy, if you feel like 5% of your needs are being met, but you're in a marriage with 3 children and a mortgage, and there's this sort of, familial and financial dependency fostered on each other, that may look different, right? That deadline you set for how long you'll stay in a relationship that is unhealthy, where you're very unfulfilled, maybe a year or 2 years. And I'll tell you what to do with that deadline in just a moment. But if you're dating somebody for, in Julie's case, 15 years, and it doesn't sound like they're married, it doesn't sound like there's a lot of, I'm not sure if you even live together. You may set this as something closer to 6 months. Now, when you set a deadline, that's just step one. Step two then becomes, Julie, making sure that you sit down and you go, okay, in this 6-month period of time, and you get to pick the deadline, by the way, okay, relative to how much investment you have in the relationship and what feels like you can really pour everything you can in for that deadline period of time. So let's say it's 6 months. Okay, so for the next 6 months, I am going to do everything I can. I'm going to communicate my needs more. I'm going to see my needs through. I am going to make sure that I'm approaching this conversation in regards to my needs with a lot of transparency and openness. I'm going to reprogram my core wounds so that I'm not taking things as personally, so that I'm hardly ever triggered. And now that empowers me to be an even better communicator. So I'm really going to focus on my needs, my core wounds, and my communication. And if within that next 6 months, I don't see that needle really move, and I'm still batting nowhere near to 80% of my needs being met, that may be a time where you walk away from the relationship. You have to ask yourself, am I okay being in a relationship for the next 15 years with somebody who's never going on a date with me? We're never spending time together. And you may see tremendous growth. You may see that by you communicating your needs and seeing them through, and being really healthy in the way that you communicate so you can really be heard, and working through core wounds, you may find that you have tremendous success and fulfillment and the relationship completely transforms. Or you may find that there's literally no shift or change. And at that point, you have to decide if it's time to walk away. So I think this is more of a question. It's a really interesting question about the creature comforts and the video games, but I actually think it's more of a question about your needs being met and how fulfilled you are and what you can do with that. And again, from the top, if we just write out all of our needs that are important in a relationship, see how much they're being met from 1 to 10, start working on where they're not being met by empowering better communication, really sharing about our needs more often, and reprogramming core wounds, we will either see huge growth in that relationship dynamic or maybe no growth at all. And then you position yourself for a win-win, because either you walk away guilt and regret free, knowing you did everything you can and that this is the right move out of loyalty and care for self, or you have an even better outcome where the relationship transforms and needs are being met and communication has improved and you feel way more fulfilled. And obviously, that's a huge win as well. So, we're about to take a quick break here again, and we're going to dive back in after this break to talk about intimacy in relationships between the fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant attachment style. And we'll really dive into what intimacy looks like, how we can create a lot more healthy intimacy in a relationship, and how the intimate dynamic may unravel in what is known as the power struggle stage, and how to really stop this from happening in your relationship if you're seeing this on the horizon or just not wanting this to happen in any future instance. So we'll be right back after this and excited to dive into Jamie's question out of North Carolina, all about the fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant intimacy and relationships. Welcome back to Can This Be Fixed? A podcast all about real life questions where we answer your real life challenges that you may be facing with strategic solutions and really work to engage in healthy action steps for how to transform these challenging events. So, our next question here is all about intimacy, really sexual intimacy in relationships, particularly between a fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant attachment style. This is from Jamie out of North Carolina. And Jamie says, everything started out great in my relationship for the first 2 years, but over time, we started arguing more often. I think you refer to this as the power struggle stage of dating, about 2 years or so in. It was at this point that I noticed a big change in my sex life with my partner as well. I am fearful avoidant. He is dismissive avoidant. And I found that the more I talked about this or brought this up, the worse things seemed to get. I feel like we are still at a standstill and I don't know what to do. I don't want to be in a sexless relationship. So let's talk about this. So Jamie mentioned something really important here, which is the power struggle stage of relationships. Now, this is originally based off of the work of Dr. Susan Johnson, but I've sort of adapted to separate out a dating stage from a honeymoon stage because I found them to be very unique and separate stages. So if we look at our 6 stages of relationships, we have number one, our dating stage. This is where we vet somebody in a relationship. Number two, we have our honeymoon stage. Okay, this is where we put on the rose colored glasses. And that dating stage generally lasts between about 0 to 6 months before, if we make it to the next stage, we basically make some form of commitment towards either a monogamous relationship or to focus on prioritizing each other more. And this is what really moves us through the rite of passage into the honeymoon stage. It's in the honeymoon stage that we will then see this last for another somewhere between 6 months up to a year and a half post dating stage. And this is where we have those rose colored glasses on. We see everything through, all of the beautiful qualities about our partner. And sometimes we even filter out the challenging parts. And as we get really comfortable with somebody over time, we then move into the power struggle stage. We get comfortable enough, essentially, where we drop the mask. We start feeling really, really safe with somebody. We end up showing more of ourselves. And in doing so, we may find that we start to see things about somebody else that we didn't notice to begin with. Now, the rite of passage to move out of the power struggle stage is acceptance and vulnerability. But if we don't know how to accept our partner's flaws, and if we don't know how to be vulnerable in a healthy way about our own, then instead what we'll find is that statistically, most couples break up in the power struggle stage. And so this may be something very likely to happen here. So what do we do? Well, if we make it through the power struggle stage, and we'll talk about how to do this in Jamie's question, we end up in the stability stage, then the commitment, and lastly, bliss stage. And the bliss stage is really like the honeymoon stage, but where you've done a lot of inner work with the person. You really know who that person is. It's not like we're still getting to know them and the mask is on and everyone's on their best behavior. It's like we truly know somebody. So, how do we foster this in this kind of relationship? Well, when we take a really clear look at this, Jamie says everything started out really great for the first couple of years, and then we started arguing more often. And as we started arguing more often, there was a change in our sex life. So, what often takes place is fearful avoidance when they communicate. They often communicate more reactively rather than proactively. We can also refer to this as negative framing versus positive framing. So, because fearful avoidants don't love to communicate their own needs because it feels vulnerable, often they won't say things like, hey, I would love for us to be more intimate in our relationship and spend more time focusing on that. What are fun things we can do to support the relationship in that? That would be positive framing, right? We're talking about the solution in a healthy, positive way. But if we're scared to have that conversation, or if we have this deep down belief that we can't convey or communicate our needs, or even if we have shame just from talking about sex in general, then what can often take place is we don't communicate. And instead, we hold things in and we stuff them down. And then over time, we end up in a situation where these come out in reactive ways, negative framing. We say, you're not caring about sex in the relationship, or you're not making an effort, or we never have sex and the relationship sucks. And we'll have a lot more criticism about it. Now, what do we know about the dismissive avoidant? Dismissive avoidants take criticism to heart, arguably more than any other attachment style. And so we set the stage for the more that we react and communicate in a negative framing way, the more likely it is that the dismissive avoidant will shut down and will really start to withdraw even more. Now, it's also very common when a dismissive avoidant is criticized, they actually think something's wrong with me. And I have had countless conversations over the last 12 years or so with dismissive avoidance, whether it's in our programs at the personal development school, whether it's in one-to-one client sessions back when I ran my practice, where what I would see is that dismissive avoidance would end up in a position where they start to judge themselves and shame themselves around sex. And it actually affects their ability to be present and to really, engage in sex. It can really affect sexual performance in a sense if somebody's in their head and they're really stressed. And of course, that's going to happen, right? Because how can you be really present and feel connected with somebody in a sexual way, in a really vulnerable way, if you're scared of vulnerability, if you're shaming yourself through the process, or if you're walking on eggshells, worried that you're about to be shamed in some way? I'm not saying that every fearful avoidant is doing this by any means, but I am saying this is a very common dynamic I've seen come about. And so, one of the best things that we can do here is we can work through not just around sex, but around the whole relationship, getting better at communicating and facilitating a really safe space for vulnerability and emotional intimacy in a relationship first. This can look like wanting to work through challenges, checking in with each other more, making sure that we get really good at positive framing when we're communicating in a relationship, and even going out of our way to counteract each other's core wounds. If you listen to the core wound part of this podcast at the beginning, we talked a lot about those big core wounds each attachment style has. And in this particular case, if you look at the fearful avoidant with a dismissive avoidant, a huge thing that's really valuable to pay attention to is that if a defective core wound is present, somebody's going to be really busy shaming themselves. But if instead we can be more accepting rather than shaming, because really acceptance or even pride are the antidotes to shame because they are the opposite emotions. The more we can present with more acceptance, less judgment, more things that we can validate so somebody feels a sense of pride instead of shame, the more we give that in the relationship overall, and not even around sex particularly, but just starting with having roots of a foundation built into the relationship where that's there, the less the person who the big shame wounds is going to be projecting the shame out onto the relationship or onto sex and then fearing it and shutting down as a way to self-protect. And so the more we have that sense of acceptance, pride, or validation and safety emotionally, the more we're laying the foundation for this person to then feel safe being vulnerable, which of course, sex is a vulnerable thing. And I find that it's necessary to make it through the power struggle stage between a fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant to get better at not negatively framing, instead positively framing, so that you can express your needs as a fearful avoidant, right? This isn't me just saying, make sure the DA has all their needs met. This is me saying, no, 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 get your needs met. The DA is way more likely to meet your needs in a healthy way when you positively frame and when they feel safe to be vulnerable and when they feel accepted by their partner. This is when they really rise to the occasion and show up. And when that is built in or sort of baked into the relationship in the background, then things in the foreground that are more, around intimacy or sex, they tend to move with that in lockstep. So what you'll tend to see is that the more there is this safety to be vulnerable, the more there's a sense of pride and acceptance in the relationship that the DA has, the more present they are around sex, the more sex feels like a fun thing and an exciting thing in the relationship rather than something that they can shroud in fear if they're afraid of their performance not being quote unquote good enough or defective in some way, or if they are feeling emotionally unsafe to really be present in that experience. So positively framing your needs, still making sure you're communicating your needs as a fearful avoidant so that you can get them met is absolutely necessary for the fearful avoidant to make it through the power struggle stage of relationships. And that's not just around sex, I mean needs in general. But then also baking into the relationship more acceptance between both of you, more positively framing when you're trying to work through problems and communicate, and also making sure that there's a sense of validation or things that will induce a sense of pride in the relationship will then build the foundation for intimacy in all forms to be much more celebrated in the relationship overall. So that's it for these 3 questions today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to ask your own questions, you can go to Can This Be Fixed on Reddit, post your own questions there, comment on other individuals' questions, or see some of the questions that people are asking around attachment styles and the subconscious mind and these topics that we discuss here on this channel. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for sharing, for stopping by, for being here. Please subscribe to this podcast or YouTube channel if you are enjoying this, and I can't wait to see you in our next episodes. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Share it with friends and family who are on their journey of personal development and growth, and thank you for listening. Next week, we'll be back with more insights to guide you on your journey. And until then, keep practicing our tools and strategies to change your subconscious mind and apply some of the powerful learnings from this podcast so that you experience real life transformation.